I never wanted to work the night shift forever. It was supposed to be temporary. Just enough to cover rent and bills until I figured out what the hell I was doing with my life. But, like so many things, the job had a way of pulling me in, night after night, until I stopped thinking about leaving and just accepted that this was my life now. The Harbor Diner wasn't exactly glamorous, but it had a certain charm. The kind of place that still had faded red booths, a jukebox that hadn't worked in years, and a coffee pot that had probably been brewing the same batch since the 80s. It sat on the outskirts of Seattle, tucked away in a spot that didn't see much traffic unless you knew it was there. Most of our late-night customers were truckers, insomniacs, or the occasional lost tourist who took a wrong turn off the highway. It was a slow night. December had a way of keeping people indoors, and with Christmas just around the corner, most folks had better places to be than a dingy diner at almost midnight. The only customers left were a quiet man nursing a cup of coffee in the corner and an older couple finishing their meal. The bell above the door jingled and I looked up out of habit. That's when I saw them. 3 men walked in, dressed rough, like they'd been on the road too long. Their clothes were worn, their boots scuffed with dirt, and they carried the kind of energy that made my stomach tighten. The tallest of them, a man with greasy dark hair and a leather jacket, locked eyes with me as he stepped inside. He smirked like he already knew me. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral as they slid into a booth at the far end of the diner. I'd been in this job long enough to recognize trouble before it started. They weren't drunk, not yet anyway, but there was something off about them, something I couldn't quite place. I grabbed a notepad and made my way over. "What can I get you?" I asked, keeping my voice light, professional. Leather Jacket leaned back in the booth, giving me a slow once-over. His grin widened. Well, he said, his voice thick and lazy. "Ain't often you see a girl like you working a place like this. You must drive the boys crazy." His friends chuckled. I ignored the comment and tapped my pen against the pad. "You guys want coffee?" The second man, older with a scruffy beard, nodded. "Yeah, and a round of burgers." "Extra fries." "Got it." As I turned, Leather Jacket spoke again. "What's your name, sweetheart?" I didn't answer. I just walked back to the counter, keeping my head down. The older couple paid their bill and left a minute later, taking the quiet man in the corner with them. That left me, the cook in the back, and the 3 men. The diner felt smaller. I brought their food over quickly, keeping the conversation to a minimum. But every time I passed by their booth, I could feel Leather Jacket's eyes on me. I knew that stare, the kind that wasn't just looking, but measuring, calculating, the way you'd look at something you wanted to take. "Why so quiet, sweetheart?" he said when I dropped off their drinks. His fingers brushed mine when he reached for the coffee. "Not shy, are you?" I pulled my hand back, forcing a polite smile. "Just busy." "You don't look busy." His friends laughed. I turned on my heel before he could say anything else. The clock on the wall inched toward closing time. I counted down the minutes, hoping they'd eat fast and leave, but they weren't in any hurry. They lingered, laughing, talking low between bites. Every so often, one of them would glance my way, like they were sharing some private joke at my expense. 10:55 p.m. I started clearing tables, making it obvious that we were closing soon. 11 p.m. They were the only ones left. Their plates were empty, but they weren't moving. Leather Jacket finally slid out of the booth and strolled over to the counter. I busied myself wiping it down, hoping he'd just pay and leave. He leaned against the counter, smirking. "You got plans tonight?" I kept my face neutral. "Just heading home." He drummed his fingers against the counter. "Home? Home? Alone?" The question hung in the air for a second too long. I forced a laugh, grabbing the coffee pot like I had something to do. "Yep, my cat's waiting for me." He tilted his head, studying me. Then he grinned, but his eyes didn't match. "A cat? That's too bad. I was hoping you'd have more exciting plans." I turned away, pretending to refill the pot. My hands were shaking. His friends finally got up, tossing crumpled bills onto the table before heading for the door. But Leather Jacket lingered. His grin never faded. "We'll be seeing you, sweetheart." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. The moment the door shut behind them, I locked it. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. It was just some guys screwing around, I told myself. I'd dealt with worse. but something about them felt different. Like they weren't just messing with me. Like they'd already decided something. I finished my closing routine fast, flicked off the lights, and grabbed my bag. The diner was silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. I stepped outside into the cold night air. The employee parking lot was small, just a few dim streetlights casting long, thin shadows. And then I saw him. Leather jacket was leaning against my car, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. "Hey," he called out, his voice too casual. "Figured I'd wait for you. Thought we could have that chat you were too busy for earlier." Panic tightened my chest. "I'm really tired," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Just want to go home." He stepped away from the car, moving closer. "Come on, don't be like that. I'm just trying to be friendly." Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I was alone, no one around, no help coming. I gripped my keys between my fingers, the sharp ends sticking out like claws. He took another step. "You don't need to be scared," he said softly. "I just want to talk." I swung my keys before I even knew what I was doing. They slashed across his cheek. He stumbled back, cursing, and I bolted for my car. My hands shook so bad I could barely get the door open. Footsteps pounded behind me. I threw myself inside, slammed the door, and hit the lock just as he reached for the handle. Bang! He slammed his palm against the window, his face twisted in rage. "Open the door." I shoved the key into the ignition and tore out of the lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't stop until I was halfway home, hands clenched so tight around the wheel my knuckles went white. I filed a police report the next day. They never found him, but every night since, when I step out of the diner, I feel his eyes on me, and I wonder if next time I won't be so lucky. I used to think that fear was something you could leave behind, that once you outran it, once you got far enough away, it couldn't touch you anymore. But fear has a way of following you, of sinking into your bones and whispering that no matter where you go, you are never truly safe. After that night at the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nick was still watching, that at any moment I'd turn a corner and see him waiting, smiling, that same slow, knowing smile. I told myself I needed a break, a fresh start, and what better way to reclaim my sense of freedom than to travel, to be anywhere but in that dimly lit parking lot with his voice curling around my name like a promise. So I went to Barcelona. I'd always dreamed of wandering through foreign streets, of sipping wine in hidden cafes and breathing in the scent of salt and stone. I wanted to be anonymous, to get lost in the rhythm of a city that didn't know my name. For the first few days, it worked. I spent my mornings exploring the Gothic Quarter, getting lost in its maze of narrow streets, and my afternoons by the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore. It felt good to be somewhere new, somewhere untouched by the ghosts of my past, but ghosts have a way of finding you. It was my 5th night in Barcelona. I had spent the day hiking Montjuic, my legs sore from the endless steps, my skin warm from the sun. By the time evening fell, I was starving. I found a small tapas restaurant tucked away in a quiet alley, the kind of place you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. There was something comforting about its dim lighting, the soft murmur of Spanish conversations blending with the clink of glasses and the scent of grilled seafood. I picked a table near the window where the night breeze could filter in and ordered a glass of Rioja and a plate of patatas bravas. That's when I saw him. He was sitting alone, a few tables over, a man in his 50s with slicked back hair and a sun-weathered face. At first, I didn't think much of him. He looked like any other traveler, dressed casually in khaki shorts and a button-up shirt. But then, I noticed his eyes. He wasn't just glancing around the restaurant like everyone else, he was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that he was probably just a lonely tourist looking for someone to talk to. But as I sipped my wine, I could feel his gaze lingering, the kind of gaze that made my skin prickle, made me hyper-aware of every move I made. I focused on my food, scrolling through my phone, anything to avoid looking up. But then I heard the scrape of a chair, the soft thud of footsteps approaching. "Mind if I sit?" His voice was thick with an accent, his Spanish laced with something else. I looked up, forcing a polite smile. "I'm just finishing up, actually." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a minute, I couldn't help but notice... You're here alone, yes?" Something about the way he said it made a chill creep up my spine. It wasn't just a question, it was a confirmation. I nodded, keeping my tone light. Just visiting for a few days. His smile widened, but his eyes stayed sharp, calculating. Barcelona is a beautiful city, but it can be dangerous. My fingers tightened around my glass. I've been fine so far. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. You should be careful. Not everyone you meet has good intentions. I laughed, but it felt forced. I'll keep that in mind. I stood up, grabbing my bag, but before I could take a step, he stood too. Too quickly. Let me walk you back. I shook my head. No, thank you. I know my way. For a second, he didn't move. Just stood there, staring, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. See you around. I left the restaurant with my heart hammering in my chest, my hands clenching the strap of my bag so tightly my knuckles ached. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird conversation with a lonely man. But as I made my way through the dark, winding streets, the feeling didn't go away. And then I heard it. Footsteps. At first they were faint, barely noticeable. But as I turned onto a narrow, quiet street, they grew louder, closer. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to confirm what I already knew, but I did, and there he was, a few steps behind me, his pace matching mine. A cold knot of fear twisted in my stomach. I quickened my pace. So did he. My apartment was only a few blocks away, but I didn't want to lead him there. I turned down another street, doubling back toward a busier plaza, hoping to lose him. But he followed. He wasn't just walking in the same direction, he was following me. My mind raced. What do I do? My hands were slick with sweat as I reached for my phone, pretending to make a call. Hey, I'm almost there, I said loudly, my voice shaking just enough to sound real. It didn't work. He didn't slow down. I turned the corner onto my street, practically running now, my keys already in my hand. My building was in sight, almost there, and then I saw his shadow stretch across the pavement behind me. I shoved my key into the lock, my hands trembling. The door wouldn't open fast enough. I felt the air shift behind me, the weight of his presence too close. I yanked the door open and slammed it shut just as he reached the entrance. Through the glass he just stood there, watching. Not moving, not leaving, just staring. I ran to my apartment, locking every door, every window, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. I told myself I was safe, that the locked door was enough. But then, sometime around 3 a.m., I heard it, a soft tapping. I lay frozen in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. Slowly, I turned my head, and there he was, his face inches from the glass, his breath fogging up the pane. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that made my blood turn to ice. I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. My voice was barely a whisper as I dialed the emergency number, choking out the words in broken Spanish. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. I cut my trip short. I couldn't stay there, not after that. But even back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in some darkened alley, he was still watching. Because when I got off the plane and turned on my phone, there was a single unread message from an unknown number. See you soon. I used to believe that fear had a face, that it came in the form of a man lurking outside your window or footsteps echoing too closely behind you in a dark alley, that fear was something tangible, something you could run from. But Barcelona taught me that fear isn't always loud, that sometimes it doesn't wear a mask. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching, waiting, and you don't even realize it until it's too late. I left Spain knowing that I would never be the same. No matter how far I traveled, the fear had already taken root. The feeling of being hunted, of being seen, didn't just disappear. I needed something to ground me, to distract me from the paranoia that had burrowed into my bones. So when I got the opportunity to work under Victor Romero, one of the most renowned chefs in Chicago, I didn't hesitate. It was the kind of job you couldn't say no to. An exclusive, high-expend restaurant with a months-long waitlist and a clientele that included celebrities, politicians, and the city's elite. The kind of place that could make or break a chef's career. I told myself this was it, a fresh start, a new beginning. I should have known better. From the moment I stepped into the kitchen, I felt it. There was a tension in the air, a pressure that had nothing to do with the usual chaos of a fine dining restaurant. The staff was quiet, efficient, almost mechanical. Everyone knew their role and no one questioned anything. The kitchen was pristine, almost too perfect, the stainless steel counters gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. And then there was Victor. I had heard the stories, his obsession with perfection, his impossible standards, his temper, but none of it prepared me for the man himself. He was tall, lean, with graying hair and piercing dark eyes that seemed to see through you. He rarely spoke, but when he did, everyone listened. Every dish that left the kitchen was inspected, tasted, scrutinized. If it wasn't perfect, it never made it past the pass. I wanted to impress him. For weeks, I worked harder than I ever had, staying late, perfecting my technique, learning his methods. But the more time I spent in that kitchen, the more I began to notice things, strange things, like how Victor never let anyone else handle the special ingredients, how he always worked alone after hours, long after the rest of us had gone home, how the walk-in fridge, his personal storage, was always locked. And then there were the regulars. They weren't like the other customers. They came in almost every night, dressed in designer suits and expensive jewelry, their eyes hungry in a way that had nothing to do with the food. They never ordered from the menu. Instead, Victor would prepare something special, something they never spoke about. One night, after closing, I stayed late to finish some prep work. The rest of the staff had already left, but Victor was still there, moving in and out of the walk-in fridge with a large, unmarked container. I should have ignored it, but I didn't. When he finally disappeared into his office, I took my chance. The walk-in fridge door was slightly ajar. I stepped inside. At first, everything looked normal. Shelves of fresh produce, cuts of meat, dairy, all the usual supplies. But as I moved further in, I noticed a small metal door at the back. It was slightly open, revealing a room beyond the fridge, one that shouldn't have existed. My pulse quickened. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, something metallic, thick, clinging to the air. The room was small, cold, lined with steel tables, and on those tables were jars filled with a dark, viscous liquid, and then I saw the altar. It was covered in strange symbols, the kind I didn't recognize. Candles had burned down to stubs, and in the center was a large wooden bowl filled with something thick and red. Blood. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some eccentric chef's ritual. This was something else. And then I heard it. A soft whispering. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in any language I recognized. And it was coming from the walls. I turned to run, but Victor was standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he smiled. "You shouldn't be here, Jason." My stomach dropped. What? What is this? My voice barely worked. Victor stepped inside, calm, unbothered, like he had expected this all along. "This," he said, gesturing to the altar, "is what keeps them coming back." I shook my head. "What the hell are you talking about?" His smile widened. "The restaurant, the customers, the success. It's not just the food. It's this, the offering." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "You're insane." Victor sighed, like I was a child who didn't understand. "Think about it. The regulars, you've seen them. They don't just eat, they devour. They crave. The more I give, the more they want. They can't stay away." My mind was racing. "You're saying you're sacrificing something?" "Someone?" Victor tilted his head. "Sacrifice is such a dramatic word, but yes, the offering must be made, and in return," he gestured around the pristine kitchen, "success, power, perfection." I took a step back. "I don't want any part of this." His expression darkened. "You already are." And that's when I knew he wasn't going to let me leave. I ran. I shoved past him, bolting through the kitchen, past the empty dining room, out into the night. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, gasping for breath, my heart slamming against my ribs. I didn't go back. I didn't collect my paycheck, my knives, nothing. I just left. But some nights I wonder if Victor's ritual is still working. If the restaurant is still there, packed with customers who can't quite explain why they keep coming back. And then I think about the whispers in the walls. and I pray that I never hear them again. There's something about working in restaurants that changes you. It's not just the exhaustion, the endless repetition, or the burn scars you collect like tally marks. It's the way you start noticing things, the way people eat, the way they move, the way their eyes linger just a little too long. I learned that in Chicago, in Victor's kitchen, and I learned it again in Colorado, but this time, the horror wasn't hidden in a walk-in fridge. It was standing right outside my diner, watching. After I fled Chicago, I promised myself I'd step away from high-expense restaurants, from the kind of places that demand too much and give too little. So I took a job at the Rusty Spoon, a small-town diner in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. It was quiet, easy work. The regulars were predictable. The old men who came in for black coffee at sunrise, the families stopping by after church, the truckers who passed through at all hours of the night. And then there was Daniel. I don't remember the first time he came in. He must have been just another face, another customer ordering coffee and eggs, but at some point he became a fixture, always sitting at the same booth, always ordering the same thing. He was younger than most of the regulars, maybe in his late 30s, with dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of eyes that never seemed to blink enough. At first I thought nothing of it. Some people are just creatures of habit. But then he started talking more. "You're new here," he said one evening, stirring his coffee too slowly. I nodded. "Yeah, moved here a few months ago." His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. "You don't seem like you're from around here." I forced a smile. "Guess I'm not." He smiled back, but something about it made my skin crawl. At first it was small things, questions that felt a little too personal, a little too persistent. He'd ask if I had family nearby, if I lived alone, if I ever got scared working the late shift. Harmless, maybe, but then the tips started getting bigger. Too big. "You deserve a little extra," he'd say, his voice smooth and easy. I started avoiding his booth, letting the other waitress Sarah take his orders when she could. But Daniel didn't like that. "You're my favorite," he told me one night when I couldn't avoid him. "It's not the same when you're not around." I laughed, brushing it off. "I'm just a waitress, Daniel." His smile never wavered. "You're more than that." That was when I started noticing him outside. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. He lived nearby after all. Maybe he just happened to be walking past the diner, just happened to be on the same street when I left my shift. But then, it started happening every night. I'd walk out after closing, and there he'd be, standing across the street, watching. He never called out, never waved, just stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting. I stopped walking home alone, started taking the long way, doubling back, checking over my shoulder. And then, one night, he left me a gift. It was tucked inside the checkbook when he paid his bill, a folded piece of paper. My hands felt clammy as I opened it. It was a photo of me, taken from outside the diner through the window while I was wiping down the counter. I looked up, but he was already gone. I wanted to tell myself it was just some weird, misguided gesture, that maybe he didn't understand boundaries, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning I found another photo. This one was different. This one wasn't taken at the diner. It was of my car, parked outside my apartment. He knew where I lived. I went to my manager, showed him the photos. He frowned, shaking his head. "Look, Hannah, I get it. The guy's creepy. But he hasn't actually threatened you." I stared at him. "He's stalking me," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Unless he actually does something, there's not much we can do. Just be careful. Just be careful," as if that was enough. A few days passed, and for a moment I thought maybe it was over. Maybe Daniel had gotten bored, moved on. And then, one night, I found a note in my mailbox. No photo this time, just a single sheet of paper, folded carefully, neatly. I opened it and my stomach dropped. "I know where you live now. We don't have to meet at the diner anymore. See you soon." I felt my breath hitch. I turned, scanning the street, expecting to see him standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went straight to the police. They took it more seriously than my manager had, but it was the same story. "He hasn't actually hurt you. We can file a report, but unless he makes a direct threat, there's not much we can do." A direct threat, like a letter saying "see you soon," wasn't enough. I put in my 2 weeks' notice the same day. I wasn't going to wait for Daniel to decide it was time to do more than just watch. The last night I worked at the Rusty Spoon, I kept expecting him to come in, kept waiting for his cold stare, his quiet presence, but he didn't show. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. Because when I walked out of the diner for the last time, I found another note, taped to my car window. "I'll miss you, but don't worry, I always know where to find you." That was it. No more pretending this would just go away. No more hoping he'd move on. I packed my bags, left town, changed my number, but even now, months later, I still check over my shoulder when I walk down the street, still double-check my locks before I go to sleep, still feel the prickling sensation that somewhere, somehow, Daniel is still watching. Because the thing about men like him, they don't stop, they wait, and they always find you again. There's a certain paranoia that comes with being watched. It changes the way you move, the way you think, the way you exist in the world. After Hannah's story, I couldn't stop wondering how many times I'd been watched without knowing it. How many times I'd walked to my car alone, sat at a bar, taken a bus, completely unaware that someone was tracking my every step. But sometimes, the ones watching aren't even alive. I learned that firsthand late one night on a desolate stretch of highway in Houston, Texas. I'd been driving for Coastline Rideshare for almost 2 years. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I liked the late night shifts, less traffic, better tips, and fewer annoying college kids asking if they could eat in my backseat. Most nights were uneventful, just drunk couples, overworked bartenders, exhausted nurses. But that night, that was the night I picked up something that shouldn't have been there. It was past 2 a.m., and I was ready to call it quits when the request came in. A pickup on the outskirts of town near an old roadside bar. I almost ignored it. Too far, too much of a hassle, but something about the emptiness of the roads made me accept. I followed the pin down a long stretch of highway, nothing but open land and flickering streetlights. Then I saw her. She was standing near the bar's entrance, a lone figure in the dim neon glow, a woman in a red dress. She didn't move as I pulled up, just stood there, still as a statue, head slightly tilted, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I rolled down the window. "You call a ride?" She nodded, slow and deliberate, then slid into the back seat. No hello, no small talk. The only sound was the quiet rustle of fabric as she adjusted her dress. I started driving, checking the mirror. She was staring out the window, her expression unreadable. Her skin was pale, almost too pale under the streetlights, and something about her eyes felt wrong, like she wasn't really seeing what was in front of her. "Long night?" I asked, just to fill the silence. She didn't respond. I cleared my throat, watching the GPS. "Says you're headed downtown, that right?" Still nothing. A cold, uneasy feeling settled in my gut. I'd had my fair share of weird passengers, drunks, creeps, people who fell asleep mid-ride, but she wasn't like any of them. She was too still, too quiet. Then, finally, she spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. What?" She turned her head slowly, those unblinking eyes meeting mine in the mirror. "Ghosts," she repeated. "Do you believe in them?" I let out a nervous laugh. "I don't know. Never really thought about it." She smiled, just barely. "You should." I didn't ask what she meant. I just kept driving, heart pounding a little harder than before. We drove in silence for a few minutes. The city lights were still far in the distance, the road ahead empty, stretching into darkness. Then, at a red light, I glanced at the mirror again, and my blood turned to ice. She was gone. The back seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Had she gotten out? No, I would have heard the door. Had I imagined her? No, she had been right there. I twisted in my seat, looking into the darkness beyond the windshield, and then, in the rearview mirror, I saw her. Standing in the middle of the road, barefoot, her red dress billowing in the wind, watching me. I punched the gas. The car roared forward, but as I passed her, I forced myself to look out the window. There was nothing there. My breath came in ragged gasps. My hands were slick with sweat on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the city, where the streets were alive again, where the neon lights and the sound of traffic felt safe, felt real. I parked outside a 24-hour diner, my pulse still hammering. I needed air, needed to convince myself I hadn't lost my mind, and that's when I checked my ride history. The trip was never logged, no record of a passenger, no destination, no charge, like she had never existed. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I started digging. I found an old news article. 5 years ago, on that same stretch of highway, a woman in a red dress was hit by a car outside that bar. She had been waiting for a ride. She had never made it home. That's when I remembered her question, "Do you believe in ghosts?" I do now. After that night on the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in me. Seeing something you can't explain does that. It leaves a crack in the way you see the world, a space where doubt and terror seep in. I kept driving for a while, kept picking up passengers, but the silence in my car never felt the same. I thought about quitting, thought about leaving Houston altogether, but deep down, I knew the truth. It didn't matter where I went. Some things follow you. That's what I was thinking when I checked into the Magnolia Inn, a historic hotel in Savannah, Georgia. I was on a work trip, a quick stop for a business meeting, and I hadn't planned on staying anywhere fancy. But something about the place pulled me in. The massive oak trees dripping with Spanish moss, the old-world charm of the architecture, the way the gas lamps flickered against the deep blue night. The receptionist was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled into a neat bun. She greeted me with a polite smile, but there was something strained in her expression, something "Reservation for Olivia Reed," I said, setting my bag on the counter. She typed into her computer, nodding. "Ah, yes, room 306. For a split second, her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. It was so brief I almost missed it. She slid the key toward me, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Enjoy your stay, Ms. Reed." I should have noticed the hesitation, should have questioned the flicker of something unreadable in her expression, but I was tired. I just wanted to get to my room. The Magnolia Inn was beautiful, but something about it felt off. The hallways were long and too quiet, the antique wallpaper faded in places, the floorboards creaking beneath the thick rugs. As I made my way to the third floor, the silence pressed in around me. When I reached room 306, I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the brass key. The door felt cold, even through the fabric of my sleeve. I shook the feeling off and stepped inside. The room was exactly what I expected. Old-fashioned, elegant, with a four-poster bed and heavy velvet curtains that swallowed the light. A faint floral scent lingered in the air, something antique, like perfume left behind in an empty room. I set my suitcase down and let out a slow breath. It's just a hotel. But then, that night, the whispers started. I woke up around 2 a.m., heart pounding, disoriented by the darkness. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, a low, murmuring whisper just behind the wall, the kind of whisper that isn't meant for you to hear. I held my breath, listened. The words were indistinct, a hushed, rhythmic sound as if someone was speaking just on the other side of the wall. I turned on the lamp, my pulse hammering. The room was empty, but the whispering didn't stop. I pressed my ear to the wall. The voice was soft, almost pleading. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. My breath came in shallow gasps. I wanted to believe it was just an old building settling, pipes rattling, something normal, but deep down I knew better. The next morning I went to the front desk. The receptionist looked up, her smile polite. "How was your stay?" I hesitated. Then, feeling ridiculous, I asked, "Is there another room next to 306? I heard something last night. Whispers, like someone talking through the wall." The woman's smile vanished. She went completely still, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "there is no room 306. My skin went cold. "What?" She swallowed, her voice lower now as if saying it too loudly would make something stir. "It's the part of the hotel burned down over 20 years ago." I felt like the floor had just dropped out from under me. "But my room, I was just there. I have the key." I fumbled in my pocket, pulling it out, my hands shaking. She looked at the key, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. "Who gave you this?" My stomach clenched. You did. She shook her head, stepping back, her breath coming quicker now. No, ma'am. I would never assign that room. I turned without another word and ran up the stairs. The hallway stretched before me, just as it had the night before. I counted the doors, my breath catching in my throat. 302, 304, 308, no, 306. Where my room had been, there was only a bricked-up wall, the wallpaper faded, peeling at the edges as if no one had touched it in years. I stared, my pulse hammering in my ears. I reached out with a trembling hand and pressed my palm against the bricks. It was solid. Cold, as if the room had never existed at all. Something moved in the corner of my vision. A shadow just beyond the edges of the dim hallway light. I turned, but there was nothing there. I didn't pack my things. Didn't check out. I ran. The moment I stepped outside, the warm savannah air wrapped around me like a lifeline. I didn't look back at the hotel. Didn't stop until I was halfway across town, sitting in a crowded cafe, my hands still trembling as I stared at the key in my palm. By the time I worked up the courage to go back, the Magnolia Inn was gone. Not closed, not abandoned, gone. Like it had never existed. And the key? By morning it was gone too. Fear is a powerful thing. It shapes the way we move through the world, the way we trust or don't trust the people around us. It lingers long after the danger has passed, embedding itself in the corners of our minds, whispering reminders of what we've seen, what we've survived. If there's anything these stories teach us, it's that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary man in a leather jacket, a quiet regular at a diner, a charming stranger who offers to walk you home. And sometimes the things that haunt us don't belong to the world we know at all. So what can we take from these stories? What lessons do we carry forward? 1. Trust your instincts. Emily knew something was wrong the moment Nick walked into the diner. Melissa felt the unease settle in her gut when the man at the restaurant wouldn't stop staring. Ryan knew that his passenger wasn't like the others. We are wired to sense danger. Don't ignore that feeling. If something doesn't feel right, trust yourself and get out. 2. Set boundaries and enforce them. Hannah tried to brush off Daniel's behavior, to be polite, to avoid making a scene. But when someone crosses a line, whether it's persistent questions, unwanted attention, or appearing where they shouldn't, you owe them nothing. Not your time, not your kindness, and certainly not your safety. 3. Always have an exit plan. Jason's escape from Victor's kitchen wasn't luck, it was instinct, adrenaline, and knowing when to run. Whether you're working late, traveling alone, or getting into a stranger's car, always know where the nearest exit is. Always have a way out. 4. Never ignore the signs. Some things defy explanation. Olivia's hotel room should not have existed. The woman in the red dress should not have been in Ryan's back seat. We don't always have the answers, but we do have choices. When the world shows you something that shouldn't be there, believe it and leave. 5. Speak up, seek help. Hannah went to the police, Melissa called for help, Emily filed a report. Even when the system doesn't work the way it should, even when people dismiss your fears, it is still worth speaking up. Tell someone, protect yourself, let others know where you are and who you're with. At the end of the day, the world is unpredictable. Monsters come in different forms, and sometimes they aren't the kind that disappear when the lights come on. You are never powerless, you are never helpless. You have the ability to fight back, to run, to survive. And survival, that's what matters most. To everyone listening, thank you. Thank you for sharing these stories with us, for stepping into the darkness and facing the unknown. If these stories made you uneasy, if they made you check your locks twice or look over your shoulder, then maybe they did their job. Maybe they reminded you that the world isn't always safe. But if they also reminded you to trust yourself, to be aware, to stay vigilant, then they did something even more important. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to any of us. This has been Enigma of the Unknown. Until next time, stay in the light.